President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law yesterday, scoring a win for the Democrats ahead of midterm elections. Here's a bit of what he said following the signing.
We look back, we look forward, and today offers further proof that the soul of America is vibrant, the future of America is bright, and the promise of America is real and just beginning.
After months of negotiations, the Inflation Reduction Act is law, and it intends to address the climate crisis, lower drug costs, and reform taxes. But will it do all that, plus curb skyrocketing inflation? Here to discuss are Pavlina Tcherneva, an associate professor of economics at Bard College, and Stephen Moore, who's a fellow at the Heritage Foundation and former Trump economic advisor. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Pavlina, I'll start with you. What do you think, if you do think that this bill is going to live up to its name and reduce inflation, what components of it are going to address that?
Yeah, you got to look at it first as a totality and then the specific components. The way that this bill is drafted and proposed and scored, it is supposed to reduce the deficit. If it does that, that will be a drag on the economy and it will reduce inflation. These would be the macro forces that will tame inflationary pressures. But what most people actually are looking at are the components. What are we spending on? And what the bill does is actually make some targeted investments in areas that have been the primary causes, both of inflation, but also of the biggest expenses that households have. So as we know, the primary contributor to inflation has been energy. And so the bill actually makes new investments in the energy sector to alleviate those pressures. And also it extends the Affordable Care Act and prevents price increases, as well as reduces drug costs. So it does take important steps in these directions. I don't think we're going to see overnight some major impact on inflation, but we're going in the right direction.
So, Stephen, deficit reduction, that's something that Republicans have focused on for a long time. This bill does that. It also has these other interventions that are supposed to bring down the costs of energy. How are you interpreting this bill, and what alternative interventions might you offer in this moment from a conservative perspective?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, this is a dreadful bill. I don't think there's anything in this bill that any conservative free market person could possibly support. When I worked for the Trump administration, one of our highest priorities was to make America energy independent. And we had done that with the kind of all-in energy policy that said we're going to use our oil, our gas, our coal, our nuclear power, and when appropriate, green energy. And it's amazing, in 18 months, we've gone from a country that was energy independent to a country now that is reliant on Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia for our energy. It's actually a disgrace. And right now you've got, China that's building 40 massive new coal plants. They'll be producing 5 times as much coal as the United States in the next 5 years if we don't do something to build up our energy resources. On inflation, I guess I'm with the 85% of Americans who believe this will have either no impact or make it worse. I think it will probably make inflation worse for 2 reasons. One is if you increase government spending by $750 billion, that obviously makes inflation worse because you're just putting more and more money into the economy. And then, of course, the tax increases increase inflation as well, because if you tax businesses more, they have to raise their prices to accommodate those higher taxes. So I wish this hadn't happened. I think if Republicans take over Congress in 2023, they should try to repeal as much of this bill as possible.
Pavlina, how do you respond to those criticisms? Is spending more automatically going to drive up inflation? And what do you make of the kind of disinterest from conservatives in the deficit reduction after so many years of really stressing that as core to their principles? Does that strike you as being at all in bad faith?
Oh, absolutely. And also we have some major components here that are coveted by the conservatives. I mean, we are basically increasing energy production from the fossil fuel industry here in a very aggressive way. We are permitting 40 million acres of offshore public land for development. I mean, this should be something that will be celebrated, that conservatives have asked for such a long time. And so, this bill really threads that needle very carefully between what progressives have wanted, which is investment in climate, and which is where, I would say the future is. I mean, China and other countries are certainly outpacing American investment in green technology. But we are also actually recognizing that the global energy market is rather fixed. There are three major producers of energy, of oil, and the United States is investing in fossil fuel production in the near term as a priority, mind you, right? We are actually appropriating or giving these permits before we can actually do offshore energy, clean energy development. So listen, it's the focus is on energy, clearly. And if we transition to clean, sustainable domestic energy, that will be the long-term kind of security that we have, that these price spikes do not periodically occur every decade or so.
Stephen, how would you respond to the criticism that, I think, frankly, is a fair one sometimes at Republicans who, I wish they talk a game. I remember Tea Party Republicans talk about, lowering spending, lowering taxes, bringing the deficit under control, but then it seems to balloon, under each new administration, more government spending than the last, regardless of who's in charge. Maybe Democrats make no illusions about getting the spending under control, but Republicans claim to, and then don't succeed at that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that it's probably hard to think of any president, maybe in American history, has been more fiscally reckless than Joe Biden. Let's add it up. We started out with a $1.9 trillion blue state bailout bill back in the first months of Biden's presidency. Remember that? That was $1.9 trillion. And then we spent $1.1 trillion on a green energy, Green New Deal bill back at the end of last year. Then they passed a $250 billion corporate welfare bill about 3 weeks ago. And by the way, Republicans did vote for some of this stuff. And then now you have another $700 billion spending bill. So add that up, and it's almost hard to believe that this president has spent $4 trillion in 20 months in office. I mean, I didn't think that was possible. We will spend decades and decades undoing the fiscal ruin that this is causing our country. We would have to, by the way, that $4 trillion adjusted for inflation is as much as we spent to fight and win World War II. So it's a joke when Joe Biden says, I'm being fiscally responsible here, when we've increased our national debt by over $3.5 trillion in just 18 months. Now, look, Republicans aren't, I'm not here to defend the Republicans. They like to spend money and play Santa Claus too. But the one thing we can't be doing is raising taxes. History shows that raising taxes on our businesses will hurt the economy. One of the reasons, I was one of the architects of the Trump tax plan, which was an incredible success, where we reduced our tax rates and brought trillions of dollars of capital back into the United States. That's how we built the best economy in American history, virtually by the end of 2019, through tax cuts, deregulation, and better trade deals with China. I think we're moving in the wrong direction here. And my warning to people is the biggest winners of these Biden policies clearly have been our two biggest enemies, China and Russia, who are laughing behind our back.
So, Stephen, just a few points there. Trump oversaw a $7.8 trillion rise in the deficit. That was historic and was described as reaching World War II levels of deficit spending, okay? And much of that spending wasn't even geared toward getting the economy going the way that Biden has had to, and Trump obviously also had to deal with this COVID crisis, but for tax breaks for the more affluent part of the country. And we saw that also in his business tax policy, where he continued a trend that's been happening that can't just be attributed to Donald Trump. But what we're seeing is that the gap between the very rich and the very poor, CEO pay versus worker pay, has exploded over recent years. And billionaires have gained more money and put more money in their pocket during the COVID pandemic, during the last 2 years, than they ever have in American history. So I think it's going to be frustrating to some listeners who understand how difficult it is to live right now, who understand that it was also difficult to live and survive in America under Trump, that not that much much has changed. I'm certainly not a big Biden booster here or interested in pretending that he's doing exactly what I would prescribe from a policy perspective. But what I'm hearing from Pavlina is that this is a bill that catered to Republican interests. It lowered the deficit. It basically opens up more oil drilling in the United States, much to the consternation of environmental advocates. There is this side deal with Joe Manchin that was made to get him into this, that opens up this oil pipeline through West Virginia. It feels like there are a lot of gifts here for the Republicans to get them on board and to conservatives to get them on board, and yet you still seem to not really be willing to acknowledge that there's a compromise here. Or I don't really also hear you articulating an alternative plan to get down inflation. So, why should listeners take what you're saying in good faith as opposed to being something along the lines of kind of just more partisan jockeying here?
Well, let's be clear. I mean, Trump lost the election not because people didn't like Trump's policies. People loved Trump's policies. Trump lost the election because they didn't like him and his behavior. And I don't always defend Trump's behavior, but if you want to have a debate about Trump's policies, I mean, my God, we have the lowest unemployment rate in American history. We had the lowest poverty rate in American history, the biggest wage gains for American workers in 30 years. We had the lowest Black and Hispanic poverty rates, the lowest Black and Hispanic unemployment rates. I mean, the economy was booming under Trump. And then, of course, COVID hit, and you're right. I mean, I think one of the greatest tragedies of American history was shutting down the American economy. That was I think everybody agrees now, that was a catastrophic mistake.
Sure, but Stephen, Biden is also bragging about historically low unemployment rates. It seems like whoever's in office, everyone brags about how everything is great, and the American people don't experience it that way.
Yeah, exactly, because right now, 82% of Americans, this is an all-time record, 82% of Americans believe the economy is headed in the wrong direction. I mean, the cruelest tax of all, the tax that kills the middle class and lower income people, is inflation. And when Trump left office, we had a 1.5% inflation rate. During Trump's presidency, we averaged 2% inflation in 18 months. I mean, I don't actually know how you do this.
Stephen, what do you think should be done?
Wait. He took the inflation rate from 1.5% to 9% in 18 months. I mean, how do you do that? It was because of the spending. And now we're going to have more spending, and they act as if that's going to reduce inflation. I mean, that's a dingbat idea.
Pavlina, I want to bring you back in. How would you respond to a criticism I've had of kind of the Biden administration's energy approach, which it seems to be, moving away from fossil fuels, want to prioritize green energy, climate change. I don't know how many Democrats now have bragged about owning Teslas, while at the same time begging Saudi Arabia for more gas because of the crisis at home, and then continuing to fund the Ukrainian opposition, which is having the Russian conflict continue to drag on, which is also having this problem. It seems like a confused approach to energy issues. Does the Inflation Reduction Act address that, in your view?
I think it does help with the energy crisis. I mean, look, from a progressive point of view, this was a Faustian bargain. We had to do some giveaways to the fossil fuel industry so that we can get this bill passed. But it does have some key components, some major investments in climate that we haven't seen in decades. And look, I mean, these are structural problems. You can't change the grid overnight. You can't change the way agriculture is done overnight. The way, we source our energy in our homes. This takes time, and we need to make targeted strategic investments. And I think the thinking is there. Would I have liked to see much bigger and bolder investment? Absolutely. I mean, I don't think this is Rooseveltian in the way that we transformed the country in the 40s and that ushered in the golden age, but it is making the right investment in green energy. We need to be very clear about this. The days of coal are over. We're not going to go back and source our energy with coal. We have to then keep up with China, with Germany, with all the other countries that are investing aggressively in solar, in wind. It's not going to be the complete solution. We have to have multi-pronged strategy. So I am happy to see the thinking. I'm happy to see the targeted investment. I need to put the deficit boogeyman to rest. We can't constantly be talking about, and the Democrats are wrong on this, that they are touting the deficit reduction as their major accomplishment. Let's be clear. The deficit was good for Trump. Every dollar, the deficit is the government spending more dollars into the economy than it takes back. that money goes somewhere. Every dollar spent ends up in somebody's pocket. We want to be asking whose pocket, whose livelihood has been improved, whose well-being has been improved. When it is a tax giveaway to the wealthy, we know exactly where that goes.
Stephen, we'll give you the last word.
One quick thing about Germany. I mean, come on, Germany? Really? Germany tried green energy 10, 15 years ago. They're about 10 years ahead of us. And what happened was, I mean, people should know this, that Germany, it was a complete disaster in Germany. Germany is a manufacturing country that has a lot of, we talk about German engineering. They damn near bankrupted the country because they tried to run the country with windmills and solar panel. So what's happening now is that Germany is moving away from wind and solar power. They are using more coal, they're using more oil, they're using more gas, and they're rebuilding the nuclear plants. So we are making the exact mistake that Germany made 10 years ago, and we're going to suffer the same consequences. Meanwhile, China is taking over the global coal industry. Russia is taking over the global oil and gas industry. And this is not just a problem for the American economy. It is a massive national security problem that we're ceding control over the global energy markets to our enemies. I mean, that makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, of course, Obama bragged about making America like the world's greatest exporter. Biden has, in the context of this pandemic, bent the knee and opened up drilling and permits. He bragged about fracking. It seems like he really has done everything that you would want, and yet is still getting this criticism at the same time that some of these oil manufacturers are saying in COVID, we don't actually want to open up these plants again that we shut down because of COVID, because the cost benefit isn't there, because we know this is an industry that's going out. And what it takes to boost production again and get production going again doesn't pan out, because we know that this is a 20-year plant. We're only on a 10-year horizon for this kind of production. So I do think we need to come together and have a more honest conversation, as we've had here, and I appreciate you both, about how we're going to have to strategically manage the fact that oil and gas and coal are non-renewable resources, and no matter what you think politically, this transition to green energy has to happen at some point, as it's happening across the world.
Why does it have
Thank
to
you
happen?
so much, because we don't have infinite amounts of oil in the ground, and also there's
Yes,
a climate
we do.
crisis that
We
you may
have
or may not want to acknowledge is true.
We have 500 years
But
worth of
thank
oil, we have
you.
400 years of gas, and we have 600 years worth of coal.
Yeah, and if all that carbon were burned, we'd be living on a planet that wasn't exactly habitable by human beings, which is a little bit of a concern for some folks with lungs. But thank you so much for being with us, Stephen and Pavlina. We appreciate you. We'll have to have you back.
We have a
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.